Hi, I'm Josh, and I don't know when I'm going to get this video up, but I'm recording it on December 31st, 2023. And on this last day of 2023, as we look forward to a new year, I'm here to plead to you for humanity. And this whole topic has come up purely by serendipitous accident. The whole thing happened because on Christmas Day, I have accidentally developed this tradition ever since I unexpectedly found myself single again, whereby I drop off my kids with their mom at noon on Christmas Day, and then I come home to an empty house, at which time I have a bit of a mental breakdown and do everything I can to try to numb the loneliness and pain and get through the rest of Christmas. So knowing that this is what my tradition had become, I decided that this Christmas I was going to plan a bunch of specific activities so that I could keep myself occupied and not get lost in all of that as much as possible. So I purchased for myself a couple of packs of Lord of the Rings magic cards so that I could do a little bit of deck building with my magic decks on Christmas Day. I also drew a nice hot bath so that I could read A Christmas Carol, the original book by Charles Dickens, in the bath. And then I had the evening to enjoy a film called Joyeux Noël and wrap up my day in that manner. And I'm pleased to say that it worked relatively well for its intended purpose, all those activities. But I was also quite surprised to discover a common theme between these two works of art. And that is a theme of rediscovering our humanity in the midst of very unhuman or downright inhumane environments. Now, I'm going to set aside my other activity, the whole Magic the Gathering thing, because if you've been following along with what Wizards of the Coast / Hasbro have been up to over the past year, you'll know that they are the least human corporation out there. They're just incredibly horrible. But I'm going to replace that with another thing that I did just before Christmas. And one thing that I decided that I kind of wanted to do, if I can dig up enough information about the Second World War units that my mom's dad fought with during the war, I kind of wanted to make a little kind of mini informal documentary about my granddad and his war experiences. So shortly before Christmas, I sat down and I interviewed my mother just about the stories that she remembered my grandfather, her dad, talking about from the war. And the stories that she told about my granddad went along perfectly with this theme of humanity. So I'm going to look at humanity in 3 parts today. So let's go in historical order here, starting in 1843, when this little novella called A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens was published. This is a very small book that's just over 100 pages long, but it has clearly become an enduring classic, one that has worked its way into our popular media. So what I found interesting right off the bat from the first couple of paragraphs was the way that this book is written is in this slightly tongue-in-cheek, humorous manner. It also reminded me of the way in which a book I reviewed recently called The Lovely Bones, a book I did not enjoy, started out. The Lovely Bones started off with, "My name was Salmon, like the fish, first name Susie. I was 14 when I was murdered," and then it goes on from there. Compare that to A Christmas Carol here. "Marley was dead, to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley, it was dead as a doornail." And here we get into some humor right off the bat. "Mind, I don't mean to say that I know, of my own knowledge, what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail." So immediately we have this whimsical humor that is thrown into the style of writing that Charles Dickens has chosen for the book. And we see a couple of other examples of that that just made me chuckle as I was reading through the short book/story. The first ghost has appeared to Scrooge already and says, "You don't believe in me," observed the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your own senses? I don't know, said Scrooge. Why do you doubt your senses? Because, said Scrooge, a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are. There's more of gravy than of grave about you. That's good. You're nothing more than a bit of indigestion. Scrooge, with this first ghost, continues his cheekiness too, when the ghost also suggests that he's going to receive 3 visits in total. You will be haunted, returned the ghost, by 3 spirits. Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghosts had done. Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob? He demanded in a faltering voice. It is. I think I'd rather not, said Scrooge. Without their visits, said the ghost, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1. Couldn't I take 'em all at once and have it over, Jacob? Hinted Scrooge. So he's like, can we just have them all at once and get it over with? Of course, he loses that cheekiness rather quickly with the next couple of ghosts. But the narrator maintains that kind of tongue-in-cheek humor. Here's another way that Charles Dickens was describing a singer. After tea they had some music, for they were a musical family and knew what they were about when they sung a glee or catch, I can assure you, especially Topper, who could growl away in the bass like a good one and never swell the large veins in his forehead or get red in the face over it. So there you go. He was such a good singer that his face wouldn't swell up. But the other interesting stylistic choice in the writing is the fact that the story is being told as if old Dickens himself is sitting there in an armchair recounting this story to you, and he's speaking to you directly and making comments himself as the narrator of his story. Here, the narrator says, as for Mrs. Fezziwig, she was worthy to be his partner in every sense of the term. If that's not high praise, tell me higher, and I'll use it. Similarly, further on in the book, the narrator says to you, the reader, if you should happen, by any unlikely chance, to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is, I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and I'll cultivate his acquaintance. So there's this very conversational tone, as if Dickens is speaking to you directly, the reader, about the events here. And we even see the narrator saying that he believes that one of the characters in the story here is cheating at a little game of blind man's buff. Again, the narrator here says, there was first a game of blind man's buff. Of course there was. And I no more believe Topper was really blind than I believe he had eyes in his boots. My opinion is that it was a done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and that the ghost of Christmas Present knew it. The way he went after that plump sister in the lace tucker was an outrage on the credulity of human nature. Knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping up against the piano, smothering himself among the curtains, wherever she went, there went he. He always knew where the plump sister was. He wouldn't catch anyone else. If you had fallen up against him, as some of them did, on purpose, he would have made a feint of endeavoring to seize you, which would have been an affront to your understanding, and would instantly have sidled off in the direction of the plump sister. She often cried, oh, that it wasn't fair, and it really was not. But when, at last, he caught her, when, in spite of all her silken rustlings and her rapid flutterings past him, he got her into a corner whence there was no escape, then his conduct was the most execrable. For his pretending not to know her, his pretending that it was necessary to touch her headdress, and further to assure himself of her identity by pressing a certain ring upon her finger and a certain chain upon her neck, was vile, monstrous. No doubt she told him her opinion of it when, another blind man being in office, they were so very confidential together behind the curtains. So, such a cheeky narration, and one which made a very enjoyable read. Of course, this having been first published in 1843, there are some occasional words and terms here that kind of went over my head, just as far as being outdated terms that I didn't quite understand. Like there was this little phrase here. Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself from his shoes to his organ of benevolence, and called out in a comfortable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice, Yo-ho there, Ebenezer! I'm not exactly sure what his organ of benevolence is, and I'm not sure I want to know, but that does also point out another kind of odd way of writing where there's at least a couple of instances where Charles Dickens chooses to utilize all of these adjectives back to back to back, like his comfortable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice. That's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 adjectives just to describe the guy's voice, which seems like it's overdoing it a bit. But here's another kind of phrase that I didn't quite understand either. Describing another musical scene here. In came a fiddler with a music book, and went up to the lofty desk and made an orchestra of it, and tuned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile. He tuned like 50 stomach aches. Sure. And then there's this young lady who is described as being exceptionally beautiful. She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was, all kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head. She had a surprised-looking capital face. I guess if you wanted to be exceptionally pretty back in those days, you had to look like this. I don't know, standards of beauty I'm sure haven't gotten any better in modern times. But despite the occasional stumble over the kind of old-fashioned language, the writing was just so atmospheric and enjoyable. Here's another scene that's early on in the book. Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickened so that people ran about with flaring links, proffering their services to go before horses in carriages and conduct them on their way. The ancient tower of a church, whose gruff old bell was always peeping slyly down at Scrooge out of a Gothic window in the wall, became invisible and struck the hours and quarters in the clouds with tremulous vibrations afterward, as if its teeth were chattering in its frozen head up there. The cold became intense. In the main street, at the corner of the court, some laborers were repairing the gas pipes and had lighted a great fire in a brazier, round which a party of ragged men and boys were gathering, warming their hands and winking their eyes before the blaze in rapture. The water plug being left in solitude, its overflowings suddenly congealed and turned to misanthropic ice. The brightness of the shops, where holly sprigs and berries crackled in the lamp heat of the windows, made pale faces ruddy as they passed. And it's just this wonderful scene, descriptive, where even the vibrations of the clock were described as chattering teeth. And we get this overall foggy, damp English weather during Christmas time, which really sets us in the story for sure. But enough about Charles Dickens' writing. Years and years ago, I read 2 of his other novels. I read A Tale of Two Cities and Great Expectations, and I said at that time that nobody has a way with the English language quite like Dickens does, and this book sort of confirms that suspicion I had from years back. Now, I do like to give a rating to all books I read now, just more for your sake than mine. But, I mean, the question is, how do you rate a timeless classic like this? 8 out of 10, that's how. So, yeah, I've gone with 8 out of 10. Now, I love the book. That's why it gets such a high rating. The overall theme here is what I've started out talking about, and that's the theme of humanity, finding our humanity. In this case, we are finding humanity in the midst of the very inhumane environment of capitalistic laborers striving to amass wealth by hoarding it for yourself, taking it from the common pool of wealth for yourself, and thereby depriving other people of wealth. It is this very inhuman preoccupation that obviously Scrooge is involved with, and the ghosts that have appeared to him have helped him to rediscover his humanity. Now, I did dock it 2 points out of my scale of 1 to 10. One was just because it was a little bit too preachy on the religious side of things. I'm not at all keen on the whole concept of a boogeyman in the sky who's watching every move we make, and if we don't get things just right, he is going to give us another life after this one, but that life is going to be pure torture, nothing but torture. And as we see by the 3 ghosts whose miserable afterlives have led them to Scrooge here to teach him a lesson and pass on this morality tale. And while I know it's just a lighthearted, enjoyable tale with a good lesson to it, and I shouldn't maybe read that much into it, I do have a lot of baggage and a lot of real kind of horrible experiences on the religious side of things. So that part was a bit of a downer overall. And then the other thing that actually surprised me about the book in comparison to its adaptations in movies and in TV is the ending was so rushed and so unsatisfying in comparison to the way that the films portray it. So we have all this amazing buildup of Scrooge being gradually changed and molded into a new person, and as the reader we just want to enjoy and kind of revel in this new Scrooge as he surprises and shocks the people in his life with the new Scrooge and his amazing new generosity. But in the book here it happens so fast. He's like, all right, send a turkey to the Cratchits, I'm gonna go visit this person, we'll hang out for a bit, and the end. And it's like, but wait, I just wanted to just soak in and enjoy this moment for a while, just like they do in the films and stuff. But we're not really given that satisfaction by Charles Dickens here in his original story, which kind of took me by surprise. So I definitely would have enjoyed seeing Dickens linger on that satisfying ending a little bit longer. But that aside, it's a wonderful little book. I'm so glad I finally took the time to sit down and read it. Now, moving forward in history about 75 years to the First World War, we have Joyeux Noël, which is obviously a French film that I've watched at least once years ago, and somehow I had forgotten that this is basically my favorite movie of all time, or if not number one, at least in my top three, until I rewatched it and was like, oh yeah, this is like my favorite film ever. And one reason I love it so much is that it's all a true story. So this, as I said, takes place during the First World War. And it starts off on a horribly depressing note. It starts off with 3 school children standing at the front of a classroom reciting poems. We have a British child, a French child, and a German child, and each of them in their own language are reciting a poem about the enemy. The French and the British are talking about the Germans are talking about the Allies, but the message of each of the poems that these school children are reciting is that the enemy are horrible, terrible people who need to be destroyed. And so we see that this propaganda has literally brainwashed these school kids who are being made to say these words that they don't even fully understand at this point, but it is kind of teaching them a spirit of hatred towards what their government wants to call their enemies. Now we then, in quick succession, meet a couple of characters, jump into the combat of the war, but that happens very quickly, and we are very soon in the heart of our story here, which, like I said, is based on true stories, and it's Christmas time, essentially, and some bureaucrat in the German army decides that they're going to send a whole ton of Christmas trees to the trenches in the front line, and they also decided that there was a particular singer who was going to go and sing for the troops, and so the Germans on Christmas Eve are singing Christmas carols in their trenches, and the Allies, just a handful of meters on the other side of no man's land in their own trenches, are listening to the Germans sing Christmas carols on Christmas Eve, and then obviously singing in German, and then they start singing along in English and in French with the same Christmas carols. And so the soldiers on both sides of the battlefield find themselves singing with each other, and that prompts them to kind of get out of their trenches, to cautiously approach each other in no man's land, and then over the course of Christmas Eve and then Christmas Day, the following day, they find themselves kind of exchanging stories, hanging out, sharing their food, their liquor, showing photographs of wives and kids, and generally enjoying each other's company. They continued to sing music together. There was a game of soccer, or football if you're European, that happened between the two sides out there in no man's land. And then Christmas Day is over, so they both go to their respective sides again, back in their trenches. But what I'd forgotten from the first time I watched this film was this kind of friendship that they formed carried on even after Christmas, to the point where the Germans received word that their artillery was going to start shelling the Allied trenches. So a German messenger goes across to the Allied side and says, hey, we're going to start bombarding you. You better come over to our trenches. So all the Allies get out of their trenches, go across no man's land to the German trenches, trenches, shelter there while the bombardment happens, and then they go back to their side again. But then they get word that their artillery is going to respond by bombarding the German trenches, so they rush a messenger over, say to the Germans, hey, you better come to our side now because we're about to bombard you. So up they come to their trenches and so forth. And so there's this wonderful scene now where these two sides, these previous enemies who a day or two ago were hell-bent on killing each other, were now friends and trying to save each other's lives. But then the unfortunate thing is that the film now then ends on a terribly depressing note where the superiors on both sides get word of what's been happening, this fraternization between the two sides, and they kind of discover it by reading the mail that's being sent out from the trenches and so forth, and they get really angry. They decide to punish everyone who was involved. So in the film, the Germans get piled into train cars and get sent to the Eastern Front to fight the Russians, and the Allies get all split up and sent to different units and whatnot, and receive various punishments from the higher-ups. And then the film ends in much the same way it began. So it began with these children reciting the poetry about the hateful, horrible enemy, but this time it's a bishop giving a sermon in a cathedral to the Allied soldiers, talking about how the Germans are inhuman monsters, how they kill and rape and do all these horrible things, and nothing short of death is what they deserve. So you soldiers need to get out there, you need to kill these Germans before they destroy our civilization. And we end on this bishop giving this sermon. So after all the happiness and enjoyment of the peaceful fraternization of the troops in the film, we get back to the real business of war. And there's this line that says, "For a moment we could forget the war, but the war would not forget us." And of course, these young men get caught up in the bigger systems at play there. So once again, we have a story of humanity in the most inhumane place possible, in the middle of a war, in the middle of a deadly conflict where human is trying to kill human, where in order to do so, it is so important to dehumanize the enemy in order to overcome the natural reluctance to kill another human. It's so important to dehumanize the enemy. So once again, we have a story of people finding humanity in these inhuman situations. Now, the next day, I also went on to read the DVD extras here, and I'm really glad I did, because it was so interesting to hear from the director and writer of the film what they were inspired by. And basically, it is all based on the true stories that they uncovered from their research. And what was interesting to me is this wasn't just a one-off event. There were many stories of fraternization all across the front. It wasn't just a one-off instance here. There were basically any time where the enemy soldiers could somehow come in contact with each other, they found ways to make friends with each other instead of to keep killing each other. And obviously every single time there was bad repercussions from those who were higher up. But what was also super interesting was the director said that they kept it as true to life as possible, up to a point where there were a couple of instances that they had to leave out because it was too unbelievable, where the real life events would never be believed by the audience. And in one instance, there was this cat. So in the film, it shows this cat that is going back and forth between the two trenches, getting food wherever it can. So when the group of soldiers meets together on Christmas Day, the cat wanders up, and the Brits say to the German soldiers, "Oh, let's introduce you to our cat Roger," or whatever his name was. And the Germans are like, "Oh no, that's Felix." And the Allies are like, "No, this is Roger, no, Felix." And so they're arguing about who this cat belongs to. That's been obviously going back and forth between the two sides to scrounge food wherever it can. But the true story that they didn't put in the film was that this cat came across from the German lines with a message on its collar, essentially asking the Allied side what was going on in their trenches. It was kind of this friendly message of who's over there. And unfortunately, an officer got hold of this and took it, cat and all, to a higher up officer who's like, "Oh, this is like treason, like almost this espionage that's happening." And he passes it up to a higher officer, and then they pass it to a higher officer until it gets to this general who's like the top of the ladder there. And the general's like, "Well, we are rule-abiding people. We will follow the rules." and that means we have to execute the cat because this is treasonous behavior. And so they shoot this cat because of this message that had been put on it. And so the director was like, if I put that in the film, no one's going to believe for a second that that actually happened. Plus, we don't want to shoot a cat in the film. They actually filmed that scene, the shooting the cat scene, but they didn't put it in the movie. They just kept it with the more happy side of the cat story. But then the other thing the director mentioned that they couldn't put in was the final scene of the sermon from the bishop. And I guess the director and writer had gotten hold of the transcript of the sermon that the bishop had given in one of the major cathedrals in Britain. I forget which cathedral it was, but they gave this sermon that was all about how the Germans were like animals. They weren't human. They were, you have to kill them, wipe them out. But in the real sermon, the bishop says that the Germans crucified babies and was going on all these descriptions about what the Germans were doing. And once again, the director was like, no one's going to believe that a man of God claimed in his sermon that the Germans were crucifying babies and doing all these atrocious acts. So he had to actually tone down the sermon from the bishop that was the kind of final scene in the movie there, which, I mean, it's pretty awful when you think about it for half a second. But overall, I just love this story. It's people who are caught up in events that are much bigger than themselves, who don't want to be there. They don't want to be doing what they're doing. They just want to make natural human connections with the people that are nearby, including those that are supposed to be the enemy. And it's just a wonderful story of humanity. Now for the third and final act, I have to jump forward to the Second World War. And like I said, this is about my granddad. So I don't know if I'll ever get around to making this little documentary about my granddad. I'm not sure whether I'll be able to track down all the information about his war activities. He died just last year at the age of 97, in fact. And that's one thing that sort of prompted me to look more into his war experience. But his story essentially was about halfway through the war in the early 40s, he was 17 years old, and he lied about his age in order to sign up for military service. And so he was 17 years old when he went through all his training, eventually was sent over to Europe as an infantryman with the Montreal Black Watch, and he fought in Europe during the Second World War. Now, turns out my granddad was about the worst soldier you can imagine. In his very first few seconds of combat, he realized that this was really not for him. The very first time that he came under fire, he basically jumped into this ditch for cover. Further on down the ditch, a German soldier jumped into the same ditch. My granddad stood there with his gun and realized, that's just a kid. Because by this time it was late war, and if you know anything about Germany towards the end of the Second World War, basically all of their military-age men had died by then, and so most of the men in the army were either very young teenagers or very old men, and so this was one of the young kids, and of course my granddad was a young kid himself, so he's looking at this young German going, he's just a kid. And obviously the German was looking at my granddad thinking the same thing, because they were both stood there frozen, and then a gunshot rings out, and it turns out my granddad's commander was kind of at the top of the ditch, and he had shot the German kid. And then he proceeded to ream out my granddad. He's like, what are you doing, Thornton? You're gonna get yourself killed. And my granddad's like, he was just a kid. And he's like, you're just a kid too, but you're gonna be a dead kid if you don't smarten up. And so he gave him hell basically for not shooting this German. So obviously they carry on with the campaign to liberate Europe, and I guess the really young kids would put up a fight, but a lot of these older German guys had the sense to surrender the instant that it was possible to do so. So they would take a lot of POWs, and my granddad said that he was pretty disturbed by how these German men were treated, both the young and the old. He said there were times when his colleagues would kind of walk away with a group of the POWs, there'd be gunshots, and then they'd come back without the POWs. He said there was a specific instance where his commander kicked one of these old German guys, and this old German soldier POW fell to the ground, and Grandad walked up to him, and basically pulled out a pack of cigarettes, and within hearing range of his commander said, "We're not all assholes," and gave the POW some of his cigarettes. And my granddad's humanity carried on to the post-war period too. My granddad stayed on in Germany for a time after the war in Europe was officially over. And one of the things he had to do was he had to go kind of house to house and make sure there weren't any Nazi soldiers hiding out in the house or stashes of weapons or ammunition or whatever. So at one point, my granddad and one of his colleagues, a fellow Allied soldier, were searching this house, and they had to look under the bed, look in the closets and everything. And he noticed that his colleague was pocketing some of the valuables. Now, of course, at this time, at the end of the Second World War, Germany was devastated. Just poverty, starvation, destruction, the suffering of the civilian population, as with everywhere else the war touched, was just horrible. But I guess his colleague was finding some valuables in the house they were searching and was pocketing them. And my granddad turns to the guy and says, "That's not why we're here." And the guy kind of looks at my granddad, he's like, "Okay, whatever," and continues to look for valuables. And my granddad says, "No, that is not why we're here." And the guy's like, "Get off it, Thornton. What are you on about? These are Germans. Don't worry about it." And Granddad did the most shocking thing you can do, which is he pulled a gun on the guy and said, "That is not why we're here. Put them back." So the guy takes the valuables of the German family out, puts them back. Then when they get outside the house, again, he just goes nuts. He's like, "If you ever point a gun at me or do anything like that again, I will shoot you in the back and throw you in a ditch." And the guy was furious, but as long as he was with my granddad, he never took any other German valuables again. However, when my granddad after the war got married to my grandmother said that for some years after the war, whenever they went to bed, my granddad would always have to look under the bed before he could settle down for the night, because he was always afraid that somebody would jump out and shoot him in the back when he wasn't looking. So he always carried that fear with him after the fact. So again, to me, these are all just instances of my granddad's humanity in the midst of the insanity of war. And for somebody like me who is very interested in history, has studied history, and yet is a couple of generations removed from the Second World War, my own perspective is that if there is one war in all of human history that was entirely justified, surely it was World War II. And yet that wasn't the perspective of my granddad. My granddad refused to have anything to do with any Remembrance Day in the years that he lived after the war, and he was always of the mind that war is a way for the rich to get richer through the sacrifice of the poor young boys that become their cannon fodder. And so that's was always my granddad's perspective on war. And that's interesting to me, because to this day, I still think that the only good Nazi is a dead Nazi, and I'm grateful that there were people who were willing to go over there and kill the Nazis and get rid of that evil. However, I'm also glad that there have always been people like my granddad who refused to get caught up in the insanity, who would not lose his humanity, who would not dehumanize other human beings who were caught up in the same insanity as he was. And you look at stats of soldiers in wars who intentionally shoot their guns into the air so that they're not shooting at other people, and you realize, thankfully, there are a lot of those people out there. Now, if only all of us would refuse to go kill people on behalf of our rich overlords, maybe the world would be a more peaceful place. But there are good lessons to be learned from my granddad, who was always proud of the fact that when the war was over, he could say that he did not knowingly hurt anybody in his entire experience overseas, which is why he was such a terrible soldier. So now, with 2023 coming to a close and looking ahead to a new year, I want to encourage all of us to hold on to our humanity. It's my feeling that our society is progressively losing its humanity. I mean, I think it started a long time ago when we started to move into these huge cities, and we're no longer living amongst small communities where everybody knew each other and supported each other. Now we started moving to these giant cities where we don't even know the people who are living on top of us, and we are increasingly isolated. I do think also that the internet, for all the good it's given us, for all the amazing convenience, I really feel that the internet has had a net negative impact overall and has really also stripped away some of our humanity, especially social media, which is why I refuse to participate in any social media beyond this YouTube stuff. And I only see it getting worse with AI gradually taking over everything. That, again, that's just going to be another step towards us losing our humanity. And I don't know if it's just irremediably gone at this point, but hopefully, though, we can somehow find a way to have that in-person contact, to hug each other and hold someone's hand, to tell somebody you love them and appreciate them, to keep connections with the good people in your life, those people who are your found family. That's my hope for this coming year, and I am so grateful for the support I receive from you, especially to my Patreon supporters. I received some just amazing gifts from some of you as well during this holiday season. I've received some gifts from Asmonda's Perfect that allowed me to pick up some fun board games. To all of you who support me, especially my higher tier supporters, Charles M, Abe O, Saver Girl, Mojo Dam, Joanna N, Asmonda's Perfect. To all of you who watch my long, rambling YouTube videos and take the time to give me a thumb and subscribe to my stuff, I'm so grateful for all of you. I'd really love to hear from you and to hear your own reflections at this time, at the end of a year and the start of a new one. Get into the comments and let me know what you're thinking. I'd love to hear from you. And I'll see you next year. Cheers. You will be haunted, said the goat. Called a lovely. But the other way in. But the other. But despite. Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickened, so that people ran about with flaring links, proffering their services. Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickened, so that people ran about with flaring links, proffering their services to. Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickened so that people ran about with flaring links, proffering their surfaces. Oh my god. The water pug being left in. The water pug being. I've read two of his other novels years and years ago. I read A Tale of Two Cities and. Miserable. But that very quickly passed. We're just basically just ground